I'm pleased to welcome Rabbi Mike Uram to speak on the topic of next generation Judaism, what we can learn from millennials. Rabbi Uram is the author of the best-selling book, Next Generation Judaism, How College Students and Hillel Can Help Reinvent Jewish Organizations. And this book won a National Book Award. Rabbi Uram has the honor of being the first ever Chief Jewish Learning Officer for Jewish Federations of North America. And before that, he served as the Chief Vision and Education Officer for Pardes North America. And then even before that, Mike led the Penn Hillel organization as the executive director, as well as the campus rabbi for over 16 years. He is a sought-after speaker and consultant on the changing nature of the American Jewish community, Jewish innovation, cutting-edge engagement, and how Jewish organizations can reinvent themselves in the age of millennials. I'm very pleased to welcome Rabbi Mike Uram.
Marilyn, thank you so much for the warm introduction. Hello to everyone who is tuning into the webinar, and to the Hillel folks who are having a pancake breakfast and tuning in. Welcome to you as well. I'm really excited to be with you. And before I start this, I want to offer a couple prefaces. And the first is that whenever something like this is offered, this is one of these books that's trying to have a magic answer to the future of how to build Jewish life for the next generation. And I want to confess that I don't actually believe that there is a magic singular answer to that question. My theory about this kind of work is that my job is to be a provocateur, to stimulate new thinking, new energy, a new sense of possibility. And so I do get kind of excited while I'm giving a talk like this, but I really want to promise that I'm not trying to convince you that this is the answer. I think that there are several outcomes, all of which could be very good. If you actually disagree with everything I'm saying, and you're frustrated and uncomfortable, and you're furiously jotting down notes about all the ways in which I got it wrong, I actually think that's a great outcome. I think about some of the most inspirational and transformative trainings I've been to and speakers that I've listened to. And sometimes what's great about it is when you disagree, but then you end up coming up with your own answers. And I see that as a success because it's still infusing the future of Jewish leadership with new energy. I think it's great if you already feel like you know this stuff, but it's giving you some new language or some new structures, or you have now a book or a slide deck to use to just kind of advocate for these kind of changes in the organization that you're connected to. And a third option, which I think is fine, is that it's new and it feels stimulating and inspiring, but this is supposed to be fun and provocative and hope-oriented. And I think we all need that, especially given what's going on in the Jewish world right now. So we're going to dive in, and please ask questions through the Q&A. We'll go through the slide deck, and Marilyn, I'll ask you if I don't see the questions come in. I'm happy to have you kind of interrupt and ask them. The conversation is always better when it's more interactive. So there are a few ideas I want to make sure we get out there, but ultimately it's the kind of interchange in the Q&A through the talk that comes through the Q&A function, and also at the end when we really open it up. We'd just love to hear the things that resonate, the things that make you uncomfortable, the things that you agree with, the things you totally disagree with. Good? Okay, so let's dive in. I want to give just a couple framing pieces. And there was a talk that a friend of mine gave many years ago to a group of 150 rabbis, where he said, the main thing that I want you to know is that from where I sit looking at the Jewish community, there is no such thing as a Jewish institution, no such thing as the Jewish community, no such thing as a Jew, and no such thing as a Jewish leader. And you can imagine seeing 150 rabbis' faces just like drop. And what he said was, of course, these things exist, but they don't exist in the same way. That Jewish leadership isn't out front or at the front of the bima or hierarchical the way it may have been at one point in time. Jewish institutions don't have the power of gatekeeping like they used to. The idea of who is a Jew is more fluid and complex than it was in other times in the second half of the 20th century. And the idea of the Jewish community is really the one that I picked up on the most. And I think what is surprising to me is there are so many situations at board meetings, at program planning meetings, at committee meetings, when we're trying to figure out how the Jewish community can do something. And we use this language over and over and over again. And my sense is it is not true. There is some amorphous thing called the Jewish community if we're talking about maybe how Jews vote in North America or something like that. But the reality is, if you're at a synagogue and you're talking about the people who pay for memberships, or if you're a federation and you're talking about all of the Jews who live in a geographic area, or you're a Hillel and you're talking about all of the Jews that are on that campus or on those multiple campuses that you may represent, it's not one Jewish community. It really is a network of small Jewish communities that sometimes weave together and sometimes don't, but there's something imprecise about that language. And that imprecision leads to imprecise strategy. So I want to drive this home. I think there may have been a time where this was more true. If you look back, most of the data that I have is from the United States. I apologize. It's just I'm using a lot of Pew research, which doesn't always include Canada. My guess is that Canada tends to be a little bit higher levels of affiliation, kind of more traditional forms of Jewish identity formation, but it's not far away from where the United States is, right? It's heading that way. And so one of the things we see is that the way that people in the 21st century, millennials, honestly, Gen Xers, certainly Gen Zers, the way that they construct identity, the way that they relate to organizations, the way they relate to religion is just different than how people did it in the 1950s or 60s. And what we see is that the vast majority of things in organized Jewish life, the whole operating system for organized Jewish life is built in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And that operating system, which was perfectly aligned with the North American Jewish population in the 50s and 60s, is now almost perpendicular with the ways that North American people and Jews access almost everything else in their lives. And here are the four big shifts I want to talk about. The first two go together and the bottom two go together, but there's been a huge shift from macro community to micro community and from one size fits all to customization. There are tons of examples of this in technology and consumer products. The one that I like to use is that in the 1950s, something like 72% of Americans tuned in to watch I Love Lucy. Same show, same channel, same commercial, same time. They were all doing this synchronously. And you think about what that meant for how you considered a show successful, that it had to reach 50, 60, 70% of a population, that those shows had to be kind of what we would say in the Jewish community is parv. They had to be neutral enough that they could reach all sorts of different people. And the numbers for success were huge. And that's how synagogues work, that there were huge events and services, and you bought your membership and you showed up. And affiliation rates in the United States in the 60s were well in the 80% of United States Jews affiliated with synagogues. And that number is now about 22% at any given moment. About a third of American Jews over the course of their life belong to a synagogue. So that's a dramatic shift. If you look at TV again, though, so I Love Lucy was in the 50s. Then it really, there's nothing that achieves the level of success of I Love Lucy. If you look at shows like, for example, MASH, the final episode of MASH, which was in this 1984 maybe, had about 45% of Americans tune in. Just the final episode, that was the peak. If you look at the next generation of shows, I looked at Friends and Seinfeld, which was 1998 and 2004, their final episodes got 18% of Americans, right? So you're going from 70 to 45 to 18, and then it really drops off a cliff. I looked at Breaking Bad, I looked at Game of Thrones. Those shows barely get 3% of an American audience. And even things like the Super Bowl in the United States, which were the one thing that kind of bucked that trend in the last 10 years, has been shrinking. And so what's really interesting about this is that a hit show doesn't need to reach 40, 50% of the population. A hit show can now reach 3% or 2%. And what that means is that the shows that were on network television that were kind of parv, that kind of were like generic, what shows are doing now to reach their audience is, if you're a fantasy show like Game of Thrones, they go full throttle fantasy. They don't compromise anything. And they recognize that they're not trying to reach everybody. So like, I'm not a real fantasy or sci-fi fan. I can't tell you what the different families we're doing or the geography, but I like the show and I watched the whole thing, right? But they didn't kind of dumb it down for people like me. And that meant that they recognized that there were certain parts of the American society that were not going to tune in for a show like Game of Thrones. Or Breaking Bad is obviously another one. It's like a very dark kind of show with these anti-heroes. So what's really interesting is that when it's one size fits all, it has to be kind of generic. But when you're trying to reach a niche part of the market, you can go much more high boundary, much more high content, much more specific in what it looks like and feels like. The second major trend that I want to share is that Americans went from being joiners to being anti-affiliation, and went from relying on institutions for support to massive amounts of distrust. When you ask, again, this is United States centric because that's where my data set was from. But when you ask baby boomers and people in the greatest generation, generally speaking, can you trust people? About 40% of people in those populations report, yes, generally speaking, you can trust people. For millennials, it was down to 18%. And this doesn't mean that millennials think that they're going to get mugged on the street. What they're talking about is they don't trust institutions. They don't, it's not, and again, it may not be stealing from them or about corruption, but there's an increasing sense that every individual is unique and special. This is a huge feature of millennials and Gen Z, and that institutions are too generic to really get them and to really provide content. So, and the other piece that you see is that across the board, this is all over Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, people are spending less time joining all organizations, not just religious, but also civic organizations and political organizations. People go to fewer meetings each year than they used to. They spend less time outside. They have fewer friends. We are living in these customized little bubbles where, your Netflix algorithm is picking such interesting shows for you that it's easier to watch Netflix than it is to go to some generic town hall meeting. And it's all the more so with social media and everything else. But what this basically means is that almost everything that we do in the organized Jewish community is about getting large groups of Jews together in one place, trying to get them to join the synagogue, to make a gift to the annual campaign of the Federation, to show up at Hillel, to get involved, to come to programs, to affiliate. All of this language is very 20th century. And there is a different way of thinking about this. And that's really what I want to show. And there is an opportunity to build or enhance our operating system. So instead of it being perpendicular with the way that people view Jewish life and identity, that we can make our strategy for reaching Jews align. And there's two key kind of philosophical shifts that I would love to see happen. And then I'll show you some practical strategies. The first is developing some new language. If we were all together in a room, what I would do is kind of ask you, like, what are all of the terms that we use to define Jews? And again, if you're in a meeting or on the board or planning the freshman orientation programming, there's a lot of like, how do we get them? So some of the language that we use is we and them. We're the core, they're the periphery. We're involved, they're uninvolved. We're affiliated, they're unaffiliated. And the problem with that thinking is that it is all measuring Jewish identity on a very linear, highly judgmental spectrum. And the idea is that all of us who are involved or in the core or who are affiliated are like doing it the right way. And if those people out there just knew what we were offering, if we could just get them to taste it, they would become like us. And it is true, if you are in Jewish community leadership, you spend a lot of time thinking about how we can get them to be like us. But the challenge with that way of thinking is that those people out there don't wake up each day thinking, I'm an uninvolved, unaffiliated, assimilated Jew. How can I be more like them? In fact, all of the research shows that they tend to have a very negative stereotype of who we are, that whenever they do show up in organized Jewish spaces, they feel judged, they feel like an outsider, they feel like they don't know the words. And so one of the ways that we were trying to reinvent the operating system was this new language. And this language originally came from Richard Joel, who was the president of Hillel International. But at Penn Hillel, we developed it in different ways. Instead of talking about things on a binary, we basically said that there are two big buckets of Jews in modern 21st century life. And it's not involved and uninvolved. And the truth is, both groups of Jews are really passionate about being Jewish, but they have different needs. They live in different neighborhoods. They hang out in different things on campus. And you can't use the same strategy to reach both groups. And the way that we define this is empowerment Jews, which probably most of us on this call are Jews that have long resumes of activity in institutional Jewish life, who did camp and youth group and had a bar bat mitzvah ceremony and did Hillel and have been to Israel. And if you're on a board of a Jewish organization, a lot of times you think that the board might be diverse because you have different ages, or you've got people from different neighborhoods, or you've got different class years in a Hillel. But one of my arguments is that those boards tend to actually be very homogeneous because they're all empowerment Jews. And so I sometimes, again, if we were in person in real life with each other, I would say to you, so how many of you went to Jewish summer camp? And 85-90% of the room would raise their hand. How many of you have been to Israel before? And 90-95% would raise their hands. How many of you belong to a synagogue? If it was adults who at a synagogue, it'd be 100% affiliation. And we think that these are obvious things, but the numbers tell a different story, right? If it's about a third of American Jews ever affiliate with a synagogue and 22% at any given time. So there's a difference between who we are and the Jews that we're trying to reach. Only 15% of American kids go to Jewish summer camp, according to the Foundation for Jewish Camp. So if 80-90% of the people in the room either went to Jewish summer camp or sent their kids to Jewish summer camp, again, we're way over here in the empowerment realm. All of the people who are really worried about BDS and people who are worried about intermarriage, or who are if your news feed on Facebook or Instagram or whatever social media you use is exploding, where everything is people posting about Israel and what's going on. Generally speaking, this means that you are an empowerment Jew. And in addition to this, empowerment Jews tend to seek out other Jews to be friends with. So you live in more Jewish neighborhoods, you work, if there's a law firm in town, you're more likely to work at the law firm that has a really high Jewish population. If you're just graduated from college, you will probably find a roommate through Jewish connections and live in a neighborhood in whatever town you're moving to, where there's a lot of other young Jews. There might be a Moishe house, there might be other Jewish infrastructure. If you're an engagement Jew, it means that you just have fewer institutional things. You may not have done camp or youth group or been to Israel. You may not be seeking out Jewish neighborhoods to live in or Jewish clubs to join. And you may be in that hipster neighborhood in the new community. You may have just used college connections to figure out where to live in that new neighborhood. What's really interesting, though, is that the reason I make this big circle green is because engagement Jews don't feel less Jewish. They don't feel broken. They don't feel like they need a synagogue or a federation to fix them. What has changed in American life is that as affiliation rates have gone down, positive Jewish feelings have actually gone up. And so if you actually get to talk to real engagement Jews, what they will tell you is that they're incredibly proud of being Jewish. They actually want to do more Jewish things in their lives. They want to live more active Jewish lives, but that doesn't mean leaving their world and coming into our world. It means they want to do Jewish rituals. They want Jewish knowledge. They want to feel less insecure. They want to read more Jewish books. They want to be better informed. They want to light Shabbat candles. What they're interested in is Judaism, not affiliation, right? And the reason I made the circle green is because what I see, not in every engagement Jew, but when I was spending most of my time having coffee chats with people who are engagement Jews, is that there's energy here. There's untapped Jewish energy. And part of the reason that we fail to engage them is because it's a bunch of empowerment Jews coming up with cool programs, and then we blast out this marketing and we hope that they show up. And what this diagram is also supposed to show is that it's not just involved and uninvolved, but like we have different stories, different needs, and different social networks. So we may be posting this stuff on social media. We may even be putting flyers up in a cafe in the Jewish neighborhood, but it's not, engagement Jews aren't seeing it. And if they are, like, how often do you in your own life show up at a program where you don't have a relationship to the organization? It's very rare. There's like, some people are wired to really take those kind of risks, but most of us don't do that. And so my theory here about showing how non-overlapping these circles are is that empowerment Jews, yes, if we do a really good job with programming and marketing, we might be able to get this to 25% today, but it's really not a strategy for true engagement. And a strategy for the only way to really reach engagement Jews is through a relationship. They're not going to respond to a program or a flyer or social media or whatever it is. It's a one-on-one conversation, and it's more like community organizing than it is like traditional programming. I'm going to pause here. I see that there's 2 questions in the Q&A. So one is, and Marilyn, I can see these. Have there been similar times in our Jewish past, like in Hellenistic times, or in, I don't know, pre-World War II Germany? And is the current situation due to general environmental influence? If so, what aspects? Great. These are both like really insightful questions. Thank you. So I don't know if, look, up until 1791 in Europe, Jews had no choice but to be Jewish and to live within the Jewish communal infrastructure, because Jews couldn't be citizens of the different little kingdoms in which they lived. That was true both under Christian rule and under Jewish and under Islamic rule. I don't know enough about the Second Temple period to know what was like, life was like when the Second Temple was standing and Rome had kind of conquered Israel and started calling it Judea, which is partly why we're called Jews, because we lived in the Roman district of Judea. But my guess is that those identities were much more fixed. And in the ancient world, there wasn't a sense of fluid identity like we have today. But affiliation, we were not as obsessed with affiliation at other times in our lives. Judaism was much more decentralized. It was much more about small little synagogues, small little villages, small little ghettos. And so this idea that you would be part of a gigantic synagogue, or that a million Jews in New York would all feel part of one federation, those are things that really didn't exist until the second half of the 20th century. And in a lot of ways, Jews were playing this weird game of, we wanted to be different and we wanted to fit in. And so because all of the Protestants and even the Catholics in America all were moving out to the suburbs and building gigantic Catholic churches and gigantic Protestant churches, and you had to be part of a faith community to fit in these kind of white collar suburban communities, Jews were desperate to become white in America, to shed their ethnicity, to fit in those Protestant suburbs and those Catholic suburbs that were emerging. And we weren't really accepted as Jews in public in the 1950s and 60s. So there's an old Yiddish poet coined this expression that you should be a man on the streets and a Jew at home, or just a normal person on the streets, but be a Jew at home. So we would pivot and code switch between distinctiveness and a more universal approach. And that, by the way, it's funny that we went out to the suburbs to fit in, but then we needed our synagogues to feel Jewish because we couldn't be Jewish in public, and that's changed. And to the second question, what's driving this? The biggest thing that is driving this dynamic is that the non-Jewish world has accepted us. And even with all the anti-Semitism that we're facing, there's still surveys that come out that show that like Jews get really high marks in terms of looking at different religions and ethnicities. That even, we always think that there's tension between Muslims and Jews, and it's actually not true. That both the Muslim community has a very high respect for the Jewish community and vice versa. And so once Jews could intermarry, and if you could go to any restaurant, live in any neighborhood, and join any law firm, you would do it, right? And that's part of it. And then the real driver of this is technology. And this is affecting every single legacy organization. It's affecting Protestant churches and Catholic churches. It's starting to affect young Muslims in America who don't see Islam playing the same role in their lives that their parents and grandparents did. It's affecting museums and shopping malls and everything else, right? The problem is the organized Jewish community functions a little bit like an old taxi cab when there's Uber, or we function a little bit like network television when there's all these streaming services. And so what I am trying to raise up here is that the essence of what we do, we're not in the business of preserving network television. We're in the business of changing people's lives with amazing shows. So we should be doing anything we can do to get people to interact with the magic and the power and the wisdom of Jewish values, Jewish ritual, Jewish communities. But it is not a mitzvah in the Torah to join a synagogue. It's not a mitzvah to show up at the freshman barbecue at a Hillel. Judaism and Jewish affiliation are different things, and I want there to be affiliation. I love being able to show up at a Jewish organization and be with my people. And it shouldn't be the only tool in our toolbox. And partly what I'm trying to argue here is not that affiliation is bad. I sometimes play that role of like affiliation and programs and attendance. All those things are terrible. They're not. It's only dangerous when we think that they can do everything, when the same set of programs, it's like, oh, well, our synagogue doesn't have a one size fits all approach. We've got the sisterhood and the brotherhood and the softball league and the yoga minyan. But when you look and you see that it's the exact same kind of Jew planning all of those programs, same Jewish stories, same Jewish profiles. And then, what I've learned since I've written the book is also the same thing plays out if you want to be inclusive for LGBTQ Jews or for Jews of color. And so if the vast, vast majority of people on these committees and on these boards, the people planning the yoga minyan and the softball league and the sisterhood and the brotherhood and are all like white, tend to be like professional, tend to be heteronormative, tend to be married, tend to have kids. If you don't have kids, if you're not heterosexual, if you've got piercings and are hipster and you're a poet, and you're not a doctor or a lawyer, stereotypically, you feel like it's not your people. And there's almost nothing you can do to be deeply inclusive if 95 or 98% of your community is heterosexual. You can say all the nice, warm, and welcoming things you want to LGBTQ folks, but at the end of the day, they're like an uber minority in that community. And so that's another way where it's not just, I didn't go to youth group and camp and I don't know all the words. It still propagates that sense of not fitting in. And so one of the ideas is maybe there is a way where it's not just more of these people trying to reach out, but through a relationship-driven strategy, you can create new entry points and new ways to connect with Jewish life. And I'm going to show you what this looks like right now. So I'm going to go very quickly on this second strategy, but the second strategy it's really interesting. If you look at linguistics and you look at neuroscience, there is a huge amount of literature about how the way that we talk affects the way we think, and the way we think affects the way we act. I know that sounds very basic, but it's more nuanced than I'm saying it. But what it also proves is that there are smart people who lead organizations that definitely can hold more than one idea in their heads at the same time. And what we end up talking about all the time ends up driving our strategy and the way we act. And basically, because the Jewish community has a huge amount of infrastructure, big, expensive buildings, big staffs, big program calendars, we spend a lot of time focused on what do we need to do for the institution. And that's real. Like I ran a $3.5 million nonprofit, keeping the lights on, keeping people employed. It's no laughing matter. And when every meeting is, how are we going to get new members? How are we going to get the freshmen involved in Hillel? How are we going to reach that next? How are we going to get them to do what we need them to do to help our institution? And part of what I'm arguing here is what happens if we invert the values pyramid? And we almost pretend like we don't care about the institution. We're not going to worry about the budget, the membership, who shows up in the building. Instead, we're going to focus on impact over affiliation. And so the theory is that you start the topic sentence with, how do we transform people's lives? To be upset, if we're going to use a Hillel context, it's not how do we get freshmen involved in Hillel? It's how do we help freshmen have the most transformative Jewish and college experiences their first year on campus, right? And then what happens is, if Hillel is making such a difference in these people's lives, they have to form communities. You can't do this transformative work alone. And then the communities need institutions to support them. But what there's all sorts of research behind this pyramid, but basically simply by flipping the topic sentence and spending a little bit more time talking about how we're going to make a difference in people's lives rather than how they can help us keep the organization strong, it will trickle down and change the way emails are written, the way the website looks, the way people are greeted, and drive different outcomes for people. Good? Okay. So now I want to show you 4 rules of engagement. And this is getting more to the practical of like, so what can we actually do? What would this actually look like to begin to build a model of Jewish life that is able to run a meaningful operating system for empowerment Jews and for the legacy Jews who want the Jewish community to keep running the way it's going to run? And how do we start to experiment and learn about models of Jewish life that might be more successful for engagement Jews, for Jews who are not going to seek out organized Jewish life? And it's a huge number of them. And the secret to the future success of our communities is finding a way to help those people live more vibrant Jewish lives. So here's the first model. Almost everything we do in the organized Jewish community runs, it's not a fancy term, but I call it the receiving model. It runs on a receiving model. We all sit here in the organization. We try to think, what do they out there want? And then the goal is we try to get them to show up in our community. Anything that requires a sign up, anything that has mass marketing, it doesn't matter if it's in the building or out of the building. If you do, Torah on tap, a lot of people say, what about Torah on tap? That's not a receiving model. We're taking Torah out to them. But the truth is, the way Torah on tap usually works, which is like a Torah discussion in a bar somewhere, is that you're just taking the 15 people who would show up at the synagogue for Torah study and are now doing it at the bar, because it's the model of how do you talk to people about what you're doing and get them to show up at that event. And it tends to still be a receiving one. Good. Usually what I would do in a more interactive presentation is ask folks. So the other model, and this is usually where I ask them, is what I call the seeking model, which instead of trying to get people to come to you, it's where the organization reserves strategy, space, and resources and time to bring Jewish life to people where they are. And we used to say in Hillel, to bring it to people where they live, work, and play on their own terms, at their education level, in the geographic place where they live, in the social networks in which they live. You're not asking them to leave their friend groups to come join your friend group, right? And when I ask people to think of models for the seeking model, it gets really hard because there aren't a lot of them. That's the honest to goodness truth. A lot of the things that people will say, they will cite amazing, innovative organizations that are changing people's lives, but it's like they still have a sign up. You still need to know that that thing exists. And they're still reaching, the data shows, by and large, empowerment Jews. But what they're doing is they're reinventing the operating system for empowerment Judaism, which we need, because there's things that empowerment Judaism isn't doing well, right? But when I think of the seeking model, there are Hillels out there in North America doing this really well, where student interns are being hired, people who don't naturally come to Hillel and work in the fraternities or sororities or in the student newspaper and bring Jewish life to their friends. And I'll show you an example of what this can look like in a second. Federation fundraising is a seeking model, because if you live in a community and you sell your company for $500 million, guess what? Federation's going to seek you out, and in a concierge, one-on-one kind of way, they will try to engage you and get you involved. But it doesn't often cross over to the programming, the Jewish programming element of Federation. I don't know how BBYO functions like internationally, but their theory of change is seeking, right? If the chapter is doing what it says in the books they're supposed to be doing, part of what those chapters do is they get their yearbooks and they go through and everyone picks out every Jewish kid they know in their high school, and they make a list of every Jew they want to get to know. And on a one-on-one relationship-based model, they invite Johnny or Samantha over to play video games on Saturday afternoon with just like 3 or 4 other guys. And then maybe the next time they do Havdalah together. And the next time there's like a new member thing for people who might be interested. And after a few relationship touches, they then maybe are asked to join the BBYO chapter. So that is a seeking model. And my guess is there's some chapters that really do that and some that don't, because it's really labor intensive, right? Okay. Second model, and you're going to see these all, they kind of like go like around and around in the same direction, but it's like a different layer of the onion each time. Okay. This is the second model. I did this none of these are in the book, because what I realized is, as I was teaching about this stuff out and about, we would have like all this excitement, but clearly the methodology wasn't getting through. So these were designed to make it really easy to kind of like get the methodology down. It's almost like this in particular is like a very silly consulting tool, but it's sticky and it's easy to kind of get under your skin. So this is what I call the Yom Kippur paradigm, and this is the Passover Seder paradigm. Again, 90% of what we do, 99% of what we do is the Yom Kippur paradigm. A few leaders, the front of the room, design a Jewish experience. They think really long and hard about how to make it meaningful and accessible to everybody in the room. But at the end of the day, what they have to do is kind of shoot down the middle for a best fit line. If it's got too much Hebrew, it doesn't work. If it doesn't have enough Hebrew, it doesn't work. If it's too short, people get angry. If it's too long. So it tends to be very middle of the road. What gets you into a Yom Kippur service is an institutional affiliation of some sort or relationship. It's because you have a membership, a ticket, because you heard the rabbi or the cantor is great, because it's in your neighborhood, because people like you belong there. So that's where you go. But you can see that all of that all the connectivity is about the institution, not about a relationship, right? And there are boundaries usually to getting involved. What's also interesting, there's in technology speak, there's something called sustaining technology and disruptive technology. Generally speaking, Yom Kippur paradigm programs are only sustaining technology. They keep Jews who already feel connected going, but very few people say that this kind of program or service is the thing that turned them on to Judaism or made them who the Jew they are today. Does that make sense? So it's essential. I'm a rabbi. I'm not arguing to get rid of Yom Kippur, but it's not the only methodology for community organizing we have in the calendar, and it shouldn't be the only methodology that we use. So by contrast, we have a Seder paradigm. And if you think about what gets you to a Seder, it's not because that's where your friends are going or because you had a ticket or you bought a membership. A human being invites you, right? And usually they say, hey, will you come to our house for Seder? And will you bring something? Will you bring a bottle of wine? Will you bring dessert? Will you bring candles? Will you look something up? We're having everybody look up a part of the Seder and bring a question or a conversation starter, right? The gap between leader and participant at the Seder is smaller. They're not up at the front, right? What's also interesting is you can totally and utterly customize a Seder to work perfectly for the people in the room, because you know the people in the room, you know what they're coming with and where they're coming from. You can design and curate this experience in a way that you can't in Yom Kippur. The power of Yom Kippur is thousands or hundreds of people doing things together, right? The power of a Seder is that you're doing it in a really customizable way. It feels like home at the dinner at that table, and you also know that you're part of something much larger on that night, right? It's not that you're opting out of the Jewish community and that given thing. What's interesting is when you hear about small group stuff, Shabbat dinners with family, Seders with family, really meaningful discussions in small groups, this does show up on the list of things that made people the Jew they are today. A Seder, a small group, a relationship-driven thing has the power to inspire people to new levels of Jewish excitement. okay? You need both. I don't want to get rid of either Passover or Yom Kippur. The problem is almost nothing we do in the calendar looks like this. And again, it's not just small group versus big group. It's how do you recruit? Do you recruit through institutional means, or do you recruit through personal invitations? Good. Okay. I'm going to show you two more, and then we'll get into some discussion. This is some more complicated stuff I'm going to skip here, but rule number 3 is about making it relational. And one of my great mentors and heroes is Ron Wolfson. He wrote the book on relational Judaism. I love him dearly as a human. And I think that one of the things that was missing from all of the conversations about relational engagement is like, well, what is it? What do you really do? What is the practical? It was almost like too philosophical. So the simplest way to kind of explain what relational engagement, actually, let me go back one step. So what would it look like for an organized Jewish community, a synagogue, a Hillel, a federation, whatever it is, to have both a Yom Kippur paradigm and a Seder paradigm, to have a receiving model and a seeking model? And the way that this would look is, imagine it's Passover night. So at Penn Hillel, we would get, depending on the year, if it was midweek, 700, 800, 900 students in the building having Seder. We would advertise all over campus, all over social media. They would show up kind of like on the Yom Kippur paradigm. All of the Seders were led by professionals or people who had like really well experienced modes of Seder facilitation. And they were big, big rooms. It was like this. But what we also did is we trained 50, 60, 70 student leaders to host Seders in the dorms, in the fraternities, in the sororities, in the student newspaper office, in the office of the student government, all over the place. And those people invited their friends. It wasn't coordinated through Penn Hillel. It was just, hey, Josh, Marilyn, Sam, will you come over to my house for Seder? What are you doing for Seder? And then we'd have 700, 800, 900 people outside of the building having Seder. And generally speaking, the people who went to the Seders outside of the building were people who probably would never have gone in the building. And we didn't even have room. On a good year, literally the building looked like this, like every seat was taken. And so what's amazing is you're not choosing between one or the other, but you're actually just increasing the capacity of an organization to create Jewish life for people. And you're increasing the number of owners. So in this model, maybe in the building, we had 6 Seders and 6 different hosts. We just added 50, 60, 70 other hosts. All of that training that went into those student leaders to host those things, those are valuable investments in the future of Judaism. So you can imagine this happening like adult Jewish learning at a synagogue. It's about courses that are in the building and meet in person, and a network of book clubs that happen outside of the building that are not coordinated by the synagogue. You just find the conveners. You can imagine a federation trying to increase their annual campaign through really good marketing and really good, even using relationships, right? And maybe there's a whole series of giving circles where you increase the number of givers overall, or you get young givers involved. And these are people who specifically are not ready or interested in giving to the main federation campaign, but might get together in a small group and do something together, right? So that is a practical manifestation of how you balance the receiving model and Yom Kippur model over here with the seeking model and the Seder model. The same thing goes with relationships, right? It's anytime you plan, for example, let's say that Congregation Kol Hamayim could get Gal Gadot to come and speak. You would get a gazillion people in Western Canada to come to that event. You'd get a gazillion people to tune in if she was part of the speaker series. But what happens in that situation is that most organizations spend almost all of their time and energy on the big event, and then they don't know what to do with the 10,000 people who show up at the event. And then you have all these people showing up at the event, and it might be their first or second time that they've ever shown up recently. And then they walk away with the same negative experience they had before. which is I don't fit in, I don't know anybody, it's cliquey, these are not my kind of people. And so to make something relational, even if you wanted to do a mega event or a speaker series, the way you could do it is you would say, not to the committee, the host committee, what should we do or who should we invite to be the speaker? But the first question to ask is who should we talk to? And before the 10 people on the host committee go and decide who to invite as the speaker, you go out to coffee or beer or bike riding or whatever it is you like to do with people you know in your neighborhood, at your work, at your swim club, at your whatever, at the preschool, other parents who have kids your age, right? Your kids' age, and start talking to them. And they're going to start to tell you about what they don't say, what would you be interested in coming to? It's not a focus group. It's a what's your Jewish story? And when you get into what they love and what they hate and what pisses them off and what inspires them, you will find common ground with them. And then you can invite them to become a co-creator. We're trying to figure out a way how to reach people who feel just like we do, that it's not relevant, that we don't know what the words mean, that we're intimidated, that we're bored, whatever the baggage is, right? So you could do that for a big speaker series. It just requires an extra step. It also means that you would plan out in advance, well, if the 10 of us are going to get 75 people to help co-own this program, how can we make those 75 people feel like they're part of something big? And what do we do with those 75 people after we have this huge smashing success? And when we get 10,000 people to show up at the program, how do we capture all of their names and contact info? And how do we follow up with them? And so the program becomes the middle of the process, not the end. And if you don't have time or energy or money to follow through on building those relationships, you may want to think differently about some of the programming, right? Sometimes you got to look, if you can get Gal Gadot, do it. You get 10,000 people, it's great marketing, right? It makes the organization look cool. That's okay. But I think that where the strategy gets into trouble is where you think this is going to get new people involved. And so again, it's not that any of these things are bad. It's only unhelpful when we misconstrue what the real potential of those programs are. So I saw we got a question about giving circles. Thank you for posting that. So giving circles are where a smaller group of people get together, and instead of giving to the federation generically or being asked to give by the professional or by another volunteer leader, it's where people get together and they say everyone in the circle is it's like a book club, right? Instead of taking a class with a professor, which is maybe akin to giving to the Federation annual campaign, this is a book club. And so you get friends together and you say, okay, everyone, to be part of this group, everyone's got to kick in $100 or $1,000 or $50,000. I don't know depends how wealthy your friends are, right? And then as a group, everybody in the group researches different places to give in the Jewish community. And as a group, you help teach each other about where to give. And some of those groups say, well, we've got a pool of $1,000 or $50,000, and you allocate out where it goes. We're going to give a certain amount of money to Federation unrestricted because we believe in taking care of the whole community. And and I think by and large, if there are people doing philanthropy on the call, I really believe you don't invest in the stock market with only one type of company or only in one company. You have a diversified portfolio. It's there is a very serious reason to give unrestricted, to do all the unsexy work that you may not even know needs to be done, taking care of poor, elderly Jews, immigrant Jews, feeding people. These are, this may not always be the sexy new charity to give to, but it's important. And then, you could also figure out how much are we going to do about Israel and how much are we going to do about young engagement and this, that, and the other. And it gives people a much more intimate sense of being involved, just like a Seder conversation does, that maybe, an outside lecturer doesn't. Hope that makes sense. Okay. But the other piece about making it relational is, how do you start to look, when I ask people, what are the most inspiring, transformative experiences that made you the Jew you are today? I've done this, I don't know, 130 times over the past 5-6 years. It more or less is the same list. The things that show up in the column of this changed me It's Shabbat dinners with family. It's grandparents in a big way. It's parents. It's seders. It is a trip to Israel, a summer camp thing, some kind of immersive experience like that. Or it is a relationship. There was a rabbi, there was an educator, there was a camp counselor, there was a Hillel person. Someone took you aside under your wing. And then the only other one that I hear is when my parent died or my spouse died, I started saying Kaddish and I got into a small minyan group. But again, that's like, it's intimate, right? These minyanim are not huge, hundreds and hundreds of people. It's like a Seder again, a small Seder. What doesn't show up in that list of things that changed who you are is a speaker series, Hebrew school, the welcome back barbecue at Hillel, the men's softball league in the synagogue. And what's really interesting about this is the vast majority of what we spend our time and money on doing in the organized Jewish community sustains people's Judaism, but it doesn't push them to new levels. And it doesn't activate people who are dormant in their Judaism to become more active in their Judaism. And so part of what I'm arguing here is like to look through what you do as an organization programmatically, and it doesn't have to be everything, right? But like, just like you have, Seder in the spring and Yom Kippur in the fall, like how do you start to think about a 70-25, 70-30 split or a 50-50 split? And that's ultimately how you make these things happen. It's a few little incremental things. Okay. So I'm going to stop screen sharing because we're at time for the Q&A, but I want to just end with telling you what we did at Penn Hillel. And I realize that this is not a model that should work for everybody or could work for everybody. But what we ended up doing was I was really struggling at other Hillels, actually not at Penn, ironically, but when I worked at Northwestern or when I was doing stuff even at NYU, Hillel, what I saw is that like Hillel wasn't cool enough to get a huge number of students. And every time we tried to do something cool, there would be all the Hillel insiders. And then all the new people who showed up often felt excluded. And what I saw at Penn was that Hillel was so full and the staff were so overworked, we had no more room for new relationships or new programs. And that was a problem. And so what we did at Penn, I had this idea of like, what if we launch a new brand? Hillel's not the mission of Hillel, right? The mission of Hillel is creating a more vibrant Jewish future. So at Penn Hillel, we launched a new shadow brand for Hillel called Jewish Renaissance Project, JRP. We didn't lie to anyone. We didn't manipulate anyone. But what we did is that Hillel kept doing all the programs in the building that it did and reaching 500 students every week. It was unbelievable, right? Beautiful thing. But what JRP did is it went out and the first thing on the job description was meet 180 students who are not already involved in Jewish life and who didn't grow up with camp and youth group and day school and were super Jews all the way through. And it was community organizing. You go out to coffee with these students, you find out what pisses them off about Hillel, about their synagogue, about their Jewish upbringing. You find places of commonality and you say, we should be able to let's do something together to change this. Or what we would say is, oh my God, this is crazy that we're having this conversation. I've talked to 30 other sophomores in the Greek system who all feel the same way. And what the students would say is, oh my gosh, if you want me to come to Hill, I am not interested. But if what you're saying is you've got a group of other people like me who feel that same crazy mix of guilt and pride and excitement and trepidation about being Jewish, and you're going to help us figure out what the hell it means, I'm in, sign me up. And so over time, we created all of these fellowships where we did really deep investment in these 15 or 10 student fellows. They met weekly. I don't think in adult context they would meet weekly, but deep investment, like a Wexner Heritage program is a deep investment in, federations sometimes do really deep leadership investments in their lay leaders. And then you ask them to start being creators of Jewish life for their friends, hosting Seder model programs. Could be discussions, could be books, could be tzedakah, giving money to charity, could be Shabbat dinners, could actually be a Seder, right? Sometimes it's with a rabbi or a Hillel staff member. Sometimes it's just the friends getting together and doing something. But it ended up doubling the number of Jewish students that Hillel could reach in any given year. And because we were doing such a cool, innovative thing, we were able to raise tons of new money. And it wasn't just for JRP, it was to support the entire enterprise. If people, donors felt like, wow, had that been there when I was on campus, had that been there when my kids were on campus, they would have been really touched by it. And because you're thinking this way, we want to invest in you. And so this goes back to the technology piece, right? Um, there were the music industry was obsessed with compact discs. They were making so much money selling CDs to everybody. But then you had this change in the way people listen to music because of streaming and file sharing, and it threatened to kill the entire music industry. But what they realized is their business wasn't about selling CDs, it was about music. And there's music is so powerful and so inspirational that all you have to do is get people addicted to the power of music, and then you figure out how to monetize it later. And it could be through streaming or through iTunes or whatever it is. And that's essentially what we were doing and that's what Chabad does so effectively. You don't pay for membership, but you go and you make a difference in people's lives, and then they want to give back and pay it forward. And so it moved to not just a membership. At Hillel used to have membership back in the 90s. They got rid of it, and it moved towards an impact model, and then asking alumni and parents to give back. And the Hillel system has dramatically more funding than it ever did when there was a simple membership model or just got money from B'nai B'rith. And so I think there is something here for synagogues, day schools, camps, federations, JCCs, Hillels, and everybody else. And it's not going to look exactly the same, but there's something here to play with. And my question is, are you in the synagogue preservation business? Are you in the program planning business? Are you in the membership business? Or are you in transforming people's lives business? My guess is if you looked at your mission statement, it doesn't say that our mission is to make sure that the next generation of Jews join Congregation Bethel. It probably says that they're going to engage in Judaism in a way that transforms them and the world, that makes them feel closer to community, that helps them live more enriched lives, and all those things. And I think just by going back to our mission statement, we can end up being like the music industry, which is doing great, and not like Kodak, that invented digital photography, couldn't figure out what to do with it, kept trying to sell film and chemicals and cameras to everybody, and eventually declares bankruptcy because they don't figure out that they're not in the film business. Kodak was always in the memory business. And anything that they could do to help people preserve memories was something they could do to help make Kodak strong and meaningful in people's lives. Okay, thank you all so much. We're going to open it up to the Q&A part. I'm really excited to hear people's thoughts and pushback and additional questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Mike. My mind is blown. And I have to say that even today, when we first gathered and we found out that Hillel was actually having a pancake breakfast where people could come together and listen to this together, I was like, wow, I never thought of that. So, kudos to Tal, Katz, and the crew at Hillel, UVic, for thinking of that. And it's a wonderful way to kind of bridge these two things. So while people are thinking of questions, I have one that I'd like to ask you. I wondered if you could talk about what has changed since when you first wrote your book on Next Generation Judaism.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, millennials, when I was doing the research, millennials were still cutting edge. And now we have, I had to add in a little paragraph somewhere that said, Gen Zs are just like millennials, but more so. But there isn't enough research to know what they look like. And in that very short amount of time, like everybody on campus is Gen Z, young people who've graduated are Gen Z. And now, my kids are even talking about Gen Alpha, right? Because you went from Z to kind of Greek A. Really funny. I think, but the bigger thing that's changed is that, it was really easy to talk about the brave new world that we were entering into, where everything was customized. And, if you, in a different kind of presentation, I would talk about how, there used to be this big editorial meeting at the New York Times where all of the editorial board would debate what goes on the front page and what goes above the fold and what goes below the fold. And at a certain point, they realized, like, this is ridiculous. Like, 10% of their readership and maybe less now, is this is in Priya Parker's book about how we gather. A very small percentage of people are reading the New York Times in print. So this big editorial meeting, which had been a huge tradition, people are getting their news as it is curated through Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp groups and Twitter. And it's the algorithm and people's social networks that are picking what gets top billing and what gets bottom billing, not the New York Times editorial board. Or that in the old days, you could, the music producer and the musician could decide what's on an album and what order the songs go in. And there were albums that had full themes, or, I heard, I'm not a huge Bruce Springsteen fan, but enough that some of his albums were like the A side and the B side of the album were written in parallel fashion, where like the first song and on one side and the first song on the other side mirror and complement and comment on each other. Now, again, people are listening to their own playlists and their own Spotify, and Amazon Music kind of algorithmically decided list. It has nothing to do with the gatekeeping of the author or the producer or the musician. And that was all kind of easy to poke fun at the organized Jewish community that was running on the 20th century operating system. And I think that what we've seen in the era of Trump, and I'm not trying to play partisan here, but there was a moment that occurred, whether you love Trump or you hated Trump. And I think that's the point, is that it was love or hate, that it affected, and you can see how it played out in other countries around the world, but polarized politics was working. And people who never would have been broad enough or generic enough to win national elections, or at least since the end of World War II and the kind of post-World War II Western era, you saw in Europe and North America much more moderate candidates generally. But now all of a sudden, the same game that gets you likes on social media of being outrageous and incendiary is what was getting Trump so much attention and Trump's opposition so much attention. And now there's like a massive proliferation of misinformation out there and conspiracy theories. And there is part of me that realizes how dangerous not having skilled gatekeepers are. Like I don't mean to be offensive to anybody on the call, but we're all like goldfish, right? Like if you keep feeding the goldfish, it'll eat itself to death. And if we are given unlimited ability to only see and hear and consume what we like, just like, you don't have any rules as a kid, you're going to eat cookies and get sick eventually. It's not just, you are what you eat, but it's what you think, and you are what you click on these days. And so it's not as easy to be flippant, but I don't think the answer is to go back to an obsession with affiliation. I think that the answer is, what I've always been arguing is, you flip that pyramid, you invert the values pyramid. And there's research that shows this. I think it was Ari Kelman and Arnie Eisen did this about young Gen Xers and maybe millennials in New York. But it's like people who are what they call unaffiliated, what I call engagement Jews. They don't want yoga and barbecues and softball leagues. That's not a safe space for them to show up in a Jewish thing. If they need a barbecue on Memorial Day, they're going to go to a barbecue with their friends. They don't need the synagogue or the Federation or the Hillel for that. If they're going to show up in a Jewish space, they want it to be small and intimate with challenging and rich content. So that also means they don't want to do a text study that's like, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Marilyn, what do you think it means to love your neighbor? And what do you think it means to love your neighbor? Isn't it amazing how Judaism tells us that it's all of these things and none of these things? What we actually find is that drives engagement Jews away, because it's kind of meaningless, right? It can create intimacy in the conversation, but it doesn't help you grow in your sense of what it means to be a Jew. What people are more interested in is not manipulation or, trying to make you a certain type of Jew, but to bring ideas. Like, for example, to say Judaism is universally focused on this idea that you have to both work 6 days a week, and 1/7 of your week don't do anything productive. It could be 6/7 of the week, of the day, of the hour, of your lifetime, of the year. I mean, you can extrapolate it and universalize it, But the idea would be that if you are waiting to find time to unplug, you will never get it. And Judaism seems to suggest the only way to do it is to have a community that does it with you and to make immutable choices, that you like draw the line in this, right? That at least is challenging content that isn't coercive. But I think that's the answer. And by the way, there are all these things that Judaism says that are countercultural, like we need curators, we need good information, we need, right? There's a beautiful midrash I've been teaching through my federation work and through Pardes that basically says that it imagines like Moses was up there on Mount Sinai. Moses is as close to capital T truth and capital F fact as any human in Jewish imagination ever got. And what did God say, according to Rabbi Yanai in this midrash? The Torah, God says to Moses, yeah, the Torah is not simple. There's 49 reasons why something could be pure and 49 reasons why it could be impure, 49 reasons why it's kosher and why it's not kosher. And what's crazy about that is that it's not even 50 reasons why, right? Even the 49 and the 49 is still missing 2% of the picture. And this is a very powerful countercultural thing that Jews can claim, that say, in a world where everything's simple and tweetable and Instagrammable, and you're either pro that or anti that, you're on the good guys or the bad guys, Judaism says complexity is better than simplicity in any given situation. And that an addiction to simplicity, to simple politics, to simple answers, to simple slogans is a kind of idolatry, because when we're afraid and unclear about what to do, we glob onto the simple, and it's seductive. The idea that in a 24/7 world where everyone's burned out and addicted to their phones, myself included, what does it look like to put it down and to unplug and to be in real life for one day a week? These are very powerful countercultural things. And I think Judaism can preach these values, and to recognize that having everything you want in your own little echo chamber, because of technology, is a recipe for sadness, right? Living a life of meaning is not getting what you want quickly. Generally speaking, what gives a life of meaning is working hard and sacrificing for something you care about over the long term. And so all this kind of customization can make you really lonely and really empty.
Great, thank you so much. There's two more questions in the box here. Do you see the demise of large congregations in the near future?
Look, again, I didn't talk about October 7th. I think it is changing things in the sense that one of the foundational things driving this fragmentation of organized Jewish life, I said it in the very beginning, was that the big change is they would have us, right? And the second is technology. So there is this moment where, with the rise of anti-Semitism and the attacks in Israel, there is a more large-scale macro community connection awakening. I don't know what it's like at your synagogue, but I've never seen our sanctuary as packed as it is on Shabbat morning. Again, I don't think it's a ton of engagement Jews, but it's people. It is definitely a segment of the membership that didn't come on Shabbat is coming because they want to feel close in this scary moment. I do think that long term, I don't see a great future for the huge number of large congregations. I think they're really they're not very intimate. They spend so much of their time and money supporting these huge staffs and buildings and programmatic calendars that it's really hard to be nimble and reach new people. I think the buildings can be a real albatross. There's a beautiful Hasidic teaching that says, like, just one gold coin, if you hold it up in front of your eyes, can block out an entire mountain. And I use it as an example of how money and the need to like feed the beast of an expensive building can really blind our strategy of how we reach Jews. But you think, I don't know, different communities are different, but the main line of Philadelphia where I live was the heartland of conservative Judaism. It was the most robust conservative community. All of Philadelphia was, honestly. And what you see all over Philadelphia are these gigantic plots of land with huge aging buildings and gigantic sanctuaries that are never used. I mean, they're used 2 or 3 times a year, right? And you have all of that real estate and property being unused and unmonetized. And yet there's this sense of like, but this is why grandparents founded this synagogue. My great grandparents, we can't let go of the dream. Let's just get the young people to show up and that'll solve the building problem. And so my guess is that there will be some large institutions that will thrive, partly because of technology. You see some of the big fancy celebrity rabbi driven synagogues on the West Coast of North America and the East Coast of, some in the Midwest. But those are, even what your congregation is doing, where they're reaching hundreds and hundreds of people in the speaker series, way beyond members of the synagogue. So there's a model like that. And I think that there'll be a lot of consolidation. And I think it'll be an okay thing. It'll, in the short term, it hurts because, look, my grandparents were part of founding a Reform temple in Cleveland. I have such physical memories of that place, and couldn't imagine if I still lived in Cleveland, like not having my bar mitzvah in the same place that my brother did, or my parents got married there, and that's how we feel about companies too. We all love, Woolworth was great and we miss it, and Target's not that bad. You know what I mean? And like, life goes on. And like, what do I do with my CD collection? I don't know, but it's really nice to be able to carry, 100,000 songs on my iPhone, and life goes on. And I think Judaism can be incredibly robust, regardless of what function, whether it's on a CD or an MP3 or whatever. There's lots of ways for Judaism to thrive that don't require like huge centralized synagogues. But the one thing I would like to challenge people to think about is like, no one ever got an award in business or in culture change for holding on longer than everybody else, right? And so there's things I detail in the book, and there's things I've seen in my consulting where everybody knows that these 3 synagogues out in this neighborhood where the Jewish population is shrinking and aging are going to merge. Not any of the 3 of them can keep it together. And then what they do is they have like a divisive process to see if those 3 synagogues can merge. They lose a whole bunch of members because of the tone of that process. And then they decide not to merge. And then they lose a whole bunch of members because people are fed up that nothing's changing. And then guess what happens? 10, 15 years later, they all merge. But in the meantime, the organizations are weaker. The real estate may have gone down in value, and they could have made more money and endowed it if they had sold early. And so I just, to some degree, you don't want to be thinking, well, I know the Titanic is sinking, but what if we get like new board games in the lounge? Maybe we'll get more people on deck to play board games. It's like part of the idea is like, no, let's build Judaism in life drafts and let's get off the boat. And I know that is hard because part of what works for us is tradition. And when you really know in your mind that the current vessel for that tradition can't continue to hold it, let's find a new vessel, and then the tradition will be more bright and more beautiful. And there have been courageous Jewish leaders throughout our history who've done that.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. I'm sorry to those who had questions that didn't get answered. Hopefully you'll be able to contact Rabbi Mike with anything specific that you want to follow up on. We will be sending out a follow-up email with details. And before we wrap up, though, I just really want to thank Rabbi Mike for blowing our minds with this incredible vision and helping us to think outside of the box or outside of the synagogue. And I want to thank each of you for attending today. Really important to us that you're here. And to everyone at Hillel, thanks so much for joining us today.